April 23, 1942, south of Gazala, Libya. The desert was silent before dawn, as if holding its breath. The horizon burned with a line of red, not from fire, but from the sun clawing its way up through a haze of sand and smoke. At the edge of the makeshift airstrip, a row of Messerschmitt Bf-109Fs waited, silver and yellow against the pale dust. Their noses pointed east, like hunting dogs straining at a leash. Hauptmann Hans Joachim Marschall stood beside his aircraft, gloves tucked under one arm, a cigarette half burned between his lips. He was 27, tall, lean, his face carved by wind and war. 41 kills were painted on the fuselage beneath his canopy, little black crosses that gleamed faintly in the morning light. Around him, mechanics moved in silence, tightening bolts, checking coolant lines, refueling under the metallic cough of generators. A corporal jogged over, holding a clipboard and a piece of captured Allied propaganda, a photograph of American pilots posing beside a Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. Marshall laughed. "So these are the Americans now? The desert sends us schoolboys with flying tractors." His squadron chuckled. One of them, Lieutenant Kruger, spat into the sand and added, "They build airplanes the way they build refrigerators, heavy and ugly." Marshall grinned. "Ugly or not, they'll fall the same." He flicked his cigarette, climbed into the cockpit, and sealed the canopy. The desert roared to life. Engines coughed, then screamed. The heat shimmered against the wings. One by one, the Messerschmitts rolled down the sand strip and lifted into the burning sky. Below, a British mechanic leaned against a fuel truck, watching the silhouettes rise. "Bloody vultures," he muttered. And far to the south, beyond the dunes and dust, 6 olive-drab P-40 Warhawks of the 57th Fighter Group were climbing into position, their engines low and rough, their paint chipped, their pilots new. Marshall banked his Messerschmitt and smiled. "American junk," he said again over the radio. "We'll send them home before breakfast." He didn't know it yet, but before the sun set over Gazala, that junk would rewrite everything he believed about war, machines, and the people who built them. The sky above North Africa was an ocean without water, vast, shimmering, deadly. From 10,000 feet, it looked beautiful. From the ground, it looked eternal. Every day, it swallowed men whole, Germans, British, Americans, Australians, and returned only smoke and twisted aluminum. By spring of 1942, the Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader 27, JG-27, ruled those skies. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109Fs, powered by the sleek Daimler-Benz DB601 engines, were the envy of the desert. Fast, agile, meticulously engineered. The perfect machine for the perfect pilot. Or, so they believed. They flew for Erwin Rommel, the desert fox, who seemed to turn the impossible into routine. Every officer in JG-27 believed they were part of something almost mythic, the rebirth of the German knight in the modern age, steel instead of armor, exhaust instead of horses. They were craftsmen of destruction, and they carried themselves that way. At their base near Gazala, the routine was precise. Before sunrise, ground crews cleaned air filters clogged with sand finer than flour. Fuel trucks rumbled between tents. Mechanics in rolled-up sleeves swore in dialects from Hamburg to Munich as they patched bullet holes with thin aluminum sheets scavenged from wrecks. Inside the operations tent, the air smelled of dust, tobacco, and victory. A wall map showed enemy positions: Tobruk, El Adim, Bir Hakeim, marked with red pins. Hauptmann Marshall stood over it, coffee in hand, tracing the route of that morning's patrol. We engage at 7,000 meters. Maintain energy advantage. Quick strike, then back home. No heroics. He said it like a man ordering lunch. Around him, his men nodded. Outside, the sun had turned the horizon into molten brass. Heat waves bent the air. Mechanics tied scarves over their faces as sand whipped across the field. A radio crackled with intercepted British chatter, short bursts of static and calm, clipped English voices. Enemy fighters, likely Tomahawks, low altitude south of Tobruk. Marshall smirked. Tomahawks. That's what the RAF called them. Early model P-40 Warhawks, supplied by the Americans through Lend-Lease. To the Germans, they were primitive, overbuilt, underpowered, and flown by foreigners too slow to die properly. He'd studied one up close. The Italians had captured a wreck near Benghazi weeks earlier. Marshall had walked around it, tapping the dull American metal with his boot. Heavy, inelegant, he'd said. This isn't a bird. It's a barn door. He remembered the cockpit, switches labeled in English, a radio tuned to BBC Cairo. He had laughed at that too. Everything about the Americans felt wrong to him. Too casual, too improvised. Even their fuel drums bore a childish optimism. Standard Oil, California. But beneath the arrogance was curiosity, because for all its flaws, the P-40 somehow kept flying in the sand. Its Allison V1710 engine, rough, noisy, unrefined, resisted the desert in ways the delicate German machines did not. The DB601 demanded clean air and constant maintenance. The P-40 could take a beating, eat dust, and still run. The Americans had arrived only weeks earlier, the 57th Fighter Group from Florida. Their pilots were young, loud, and sunburnt, wearing scarves like movie cowboys. They joked with British mechanics, drank warm Coca-Cola in the hangars, and painted shark mouths on their planes. The Germans saw them as undisciplined children playing at war. Yet behind the laughter and swagger, there was something else, a calm resilience, a kind of industrial confidence that didn't come from pride, but from abundance. If a Warhawk crashed, another arrived within days. If an engine failed, a replacement came in crates by the dozen. For every one Messerschmitt, America could build 5 Warhawks and ship them halfway around the world without blinking. Marshall didn't think about that yet. No one did. That morning, as the heat began to rise and the horizon trembled, Marshall walked back to his aircraft. His mechanic, Otto Weber, saluted and handed him his gloves. Engines tuned perfectly, Herr Hauptmann, Weber said. She'll sing today. Marshall smiled faintly. She always does. Weber hesitated, lowering his voice. Sir, those new Americans, they're reckless. They fly low, too low. I heard they use their planes as bait. Marshall laughed. Bait only works if the hunter is hungry. He climbed into the cockpit and pulled the canopy down. The air inside was already hot, suffocating. His oxygen mask smelled of sweat and rubber. He checked his gauges, oil, coolant, ammo, all green. At 800 hours, the order came over the radio. Falk Staffel, airborne. The Messerschmitts lifted from the sand one by one, their shadows slicing across the dunes. Below them, the world looked endless. Yellow sea, black smoke, and far to the west, a thin line of cloud that wasn't cloud at all, but dust kicked up by distant engines. The hunt was beginning. For Marshall, it was just another day, another easy victory waiting to be claimed. But in that shimmering horizon, beyond the reach of his arrogance, 6 P-40s were rising too, crude, loud, and utterly unlike anything he had faced before. And soon, the hunter would learn what happens when the prey refuses to die. By mid-morning, the desert had turned into a furnace. The air shimmered, the sand glared white, and the horizon danced like a mirage. Marshall's flight of 4 Messerschmitts cut through the haze at 12,000 feet, their shadows crawling across the dunes like black ghosts. The radio hummed with static. Below them, movement, dust trails. A slow climb of American P-40s in loose formation, their wings heavy and wide. From this height, they looked clumsy, like beetles dragging themselves into the sun. Lieutenant Kruger chuckled. "Targets at 5 o'clock low, probably chasing their own shadows." Marshall adjusted his goggles, amused. "Let them come. We'll end it quick." He banked left, his BF-109 slicing through the dry air, sunlight flashing off its yellow nose. The rest of the flight followed in a practiced arc, the Predator's spiral. Then, something strange. Marshall expected the usual, the P-40s breaking formation, climbing sluggishly, offering easy kills. But they didn't scatter. They tightened their line. The lead Warhawk rolled onto its back, then dove. A maneuver that should have been suicidal in the thin desert air, and climbed again with a burst of raw torque that made Marshall blink. "What in God's name?" he muttered. Kruger's voice came through the radio, sharp now. "Sir, they're gaining altitude. They're gaining." Marshall laughed it off. "Impossible. They're too heavy." Yet the laughter felt brittle. His altimeter ticked upward. And still the Warhawk climbed, its Allison engine howling like a chainsaw in a cathedral. Through his canopy, Marshall watched the sunlight glint off its wings, chipped paint, bullet patches, no finesse. But the thing moved with purpose. It wasn't fighting the air, it was using it. A voice crackled on the ground channel. His mechanic, Weber, calling from the field. "Herr Hauptmann, we can see them from here. They're," Static hissed, "they're climbing with you." Marshall's jaw tightened. "Nonsense. Our climb rate is superior." But even as he said it, his temperature gauge inched toward red. The desert air was thinner than usual, hot as breath. His Messerschmitt began to shudder. Below, the American formation leveled off. The lead P-40 peeled right, sunlight blazing off the shark-toothed grin painted on its nose. Kruger cursed. "They're baiting us!" "Then take the bait," Marshall snapped, shoving the throttle forward. The engine roared, the horizon tilted, and the hunt began in earnest. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the discipline and arrogance, a single thought whispered like sand against the steel. Something's different this time. And high above the dunes, the strange, uneven growl of those American engines echoed across the sky, rough, defiant, alive. The world below had vanished into blinding sand. The only reality left was sky, the roar of engines, the rattle of guns, and the thin silver horizon where life and death blurred into vapor. Marshall rolled hard into a dive, the Messerschmitt howling as it picked up speed. The air screamed past his canopy. Ahead, the American formation scattered, sun flashes winking off their wings like shattered glass. He picked his target, the lead Warhawk, olive drab and scarred. "Got you," he whispered, adjusting his sight. The distance closed fast, 300 meters, 200, 150. His thumb tightened on the trigger. But before he could fire, the P-40 did something no pilot in his right mind would attempt. It cut throttle. Instantly, the gap collapsed. Marshall shot past the American, his tracers carving only empty air. "Scheisse!" he hissed, yanking the stick back. The sudden climb slammed him into his seat. His blood surged, vision tunneling. Behind him, the Warhawk dove, not away, but under him, reversing roles in a move straight out of a textbook he'd once mocked as American bravado. Now it was on his tail. The sky exploded in gunfire. Tracers streaked past his wingtips, orange lines whipping through the haze. One round tore a fragment from his tailplane. The aircraft shuddered. "Kruger, where are you?" No answer, just static. He banked again, feeling the Messerschmitt resist him. The desert heat had turned the air thin, cruel. His temperature gauge spiked. Coolant hissed. He smelled the sweet, sharp scent of glycol leaking into the cockpit. The P-40 stayed with him, relentless, hammering upward through his blind spot, those shark teeth flashing in the sun. "Verdammt!" Marshall dove again. The G-forces crushed him against his harness. The desert rushed up in a blur, golden, endless, merciless. He leveled just above the dunes, sand spraying from the shockwave of his dive. For a moment, he thought he'd lost it. The radio crackled. Kruger's voice came faint and panicked. "They're everywhere! They're—" Static swallowed the rest. Then he saw it. The Warhawk reappeared out of the glare, low and fast, riding its own dust trail. It was closing, not in a climb, not in finesse, but in brute persistence. Marshall's Messerschmitt coughed. The engine temperature hit redline. Warning lights flared. He pulled back gently, praying the coolant would hold. Through the mirror, he saw the American's canopy glint, the pilot's head steady, focused, unshaken. For an instant, their eyes met across the gulf of heat and distance. One man trained for perfection, the other flying on instinct and grit. The Warhawk fired. A burst of .50 caliber tracers ripped past Marshall's wing and stitched across the sand. He banked sharply, feeling the frame groan, and pulled away toward the coast, the blue of the Mediterranean flickering like salvation ahead. But the damage was done. His oil pressure dropped. The engine screamed, then began to fade, coughing like a dying animal. He knew that sound, not the roar of failure, the sound of a lesson coming too late. Behind him, the American didn't chase. The Warhawk leveled, held its course, and climbed back into the light. Marshall's engine seized. Silence filled the cockpit. He coasted over the dunes, the prop windmilling uselessly, and set down hard in the sand. The world went still again. The wind hissed through the open canopy. Above, the P-40 disappeared into the sun, a rough, ugly shape against a perfect sky. And for the first time in the war, Hans Joachim Marschall realized he had just been outflown. The canopy glass shimmered with heat. Marshall's breath fogged inside his oxygen mask as he sat dazed in the cockpit, the desert horizon quivering like a living thing. His Messerschmitt lay half buried in sand, the propeller twisted, coolant hissing into the air like steam from a dying beast. He unbuckled his harness and stumbled out, boots sinking into the dunes. His flight goggles were cracked. Blood dripped from a small cut across his forehead. Above him, the sky pulsed with sunlight, endless, merciless, and in that empty expanse, a faint, distant roar. He looked up. A single P-40 Warhawk was circling high, black against the glare, looping gracefully in a wide arc. Its engine growled unevenly, a sound Marshall once mocked as crude. Now it sounded like something else entirely, alive, resilient, unstoppable. The American was flying low enough for him to see the paint scarring on the fuselage, the shark mouth chipped from sandstorms, and on the tail a small emblem, 325th Fighter Group, checker tails. The Warhawk rolled over and dived toward him, Not in attack, but in salute. Its shadow streaked across the desert floor like a blade. Marshall flinched, instinctively ducking. The plane leveled, then pulled into a vertical climb that defied everything he knew about its limits. He stood frozen, watching. The Warhawk seemed to hang in the air for an impossible second, then banked sharply, cutting into the sun and vanishing. The silence returned. Marshall removed his gloves and pressed a hand against the hot metal of his wrecked Messerschmitt. He could feel its pulse fading, the oil dripping, the steel ticking as it cooled. He had spent years believing that Germany's machines were superior because they were perfect. Every rivet hand-fitted, every curve tested, every pilot trained to precision. But that morning, in the blazing silence of Libya, he saw a truth far heavier than his downed fighter. The American machine didn't need to be perfect, only persistent. The desert wind picked up, whispering through the dunes. Marshall turned toward it and muttered under his breath, almost a prayer. "Ugly thing. How did you climb like that?" He didn't know yet. But back at the airfield, a German engineer was already piecing together the answer, one that would shake his faith in everything mechanical and everything German. The wreck of Marshall's Messerschmitt was still smoldering when Feldwebel Otto Weber arrived with a recovery truck. The sun hung high, the color of brass, and the heat shimmered over the dunes. Weber shielded his eyes as he walked the perimeter. He'd seen wrecks before, but never one that looked this humbled. Marshall sat on the fender of the truck, silent, shirt unbuttoned, sand caked in his hair. His flight map was torn, his compass broken. He didn't speak. Weber crouched by the Messerschmitts, cowling. "Engine overheated, Herr Hauptmann. Sand must have clogged the intake again." Marshall didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, the direction the American had vanished. That night, under the canvas hangar light at Gazala Airfield, the wreckage of another fighter lay stripped to the bones. Not German this time, American. A P-40 shot down days earlier, its frame riddled with holes, the engine half buried in sand. Luftwaffe engineers had been told to study it. "Know your enemy," the order said. But no one expected what they found. Oberleutnant Heinrich Förster, the base engineer, called Marshall over as he worked. The air smelled of kerosene and dust. "Look here," Förster said, tapping a sand filter assembly mounted ahead of the Allison V1710 engine. Crude, heavy, but brilliant. Marshall leaned in. The filter wasn't precision machined like a Daimler-Benz part. It was bolted, sealed with rough welds and rubber gaskets. Ugly, simple, effective. "Do you see?" Förster continued. "Their engine can swallow dust all day. Ours can't. 1 grain in the intake. And the DB601 chokes." He held up a handful of desert sand, let it fall through his fingers. "They built for the world they fight in. We build for the world we wish existed." Marshall said nothing. Förster wiped his hands on a rag. "We design perfection, yes, but perfection dies in the desert." Across the hangar, another crew examined a cracked P-40 propeller. The mechanics whispered among themselves. One laughed softly, shaking his head. "No finesse," he said, "but it runs." That line echoed in Marshall's head long after the lights went out. In the distance, he could hear the Allied bombers droning like thunder. The war had shifted, from elegance to endurance. He thought of that Warhawk's uneven roar, the way it climbed through heat and gravity, as if the laws of physics had simply given up trying to stop it. Back in Berlin, speeches spoke of Wunderwaffe, miracle weapons, perfect machines that would turn the tide. But here, in the desert, the miracles belonged to the men who built things that didn't break. Marshall sat outside his tent, staring into the dark, sand clinging to his boots. He whispered, almost in awe now. Not mockery, they built it to survive, not to impress. And for the first time, he began to understand. America wasn't winning because of genius. It was winning because of endurance made mechanical. 2 days later, the heat broke. Clouds rolled in from the coast, turning the Libyan desert a dull gray. In the hangar, the silence felt heavier than the humidity. Mechanics moved slowly, murmuring instead of shouting. The air smelled of burnt oil and disillusionment. Marshall sat on a wooden crate beside his grounded Messerschmitt, the fuselage streaked with sand and coolant stains. His flight log lay open on his lap. The neat, disciplined handwriting that had once been his pride now stopped abruptly on the last entry. April 23rd. Contact with P-40. Engine failure. Pilot survived. He could still hear the sound of that American engine in his head, coarse, uneven, alive. It haunted him like a melody he couldn't forget. Weber, his mechanic, approached carrying a radio, its antenna bent from the wind. "BBC broadcast again," he said quietly. "You should listen." Marshall almost refused. But something, guilt, curiosity, or fatigue, made him nod. Weber set the radio on the crate and turned the dial. Static, then a clipped British voice came through. And in industrial news, American aircraft production has now surpassed 8,000 planes per month. New factories in Detroit and Buffalo reported record output of engines and spare parts. Marshall looked up sharply. 8,000? Weber swallowed. "Ja, Herr Hauptmann. That's 3 every minute." The announcer continued, matter of fact, almost bored. The United States War Department confirms the establishment of additional assembly plants in Kansas City, Chicago, and Dallas. Each is expected to reach full operation by summer. The hangar fell quiet. Even the men working on the planes had stopped moving, 3 planes a minute. Marshall stared at the half-dismantled Messerschmitt in front of him. The parts were hand-fitted, serial numbers engraved, bolts stamped with artisan precision. It took 3 weeks to finish one engine, sometimes longer, if shipments from Stuttgart were delayed. He remembered the workshops in Bavaria, craftsmen hunched over benches, files and micrometers gleaming in soft light. Germany's pride was in its perfection, its faith that quality would defeat quantity. He realized suddenly how childish that faith was. Because while his country worshipped mastery, the Americans had industrialized competence. Their factories weren't cathedrals, they were engines of replication. The perfectionist in him resisted the thought. The soldier in him could not. He looked at Weber, who had been staring at the floor. "Do you understand what this means?" Weber hesitated. "That they can lose 1,000 planes and not care?" Marshall nodded slowly. "Exactly. We lose one, and we lose a craftsman, an artist, a machine. They lose one, and they build 5 more before lunch." The rain began to fall, rare, soft, hissing against the tin roof of the hangar. Marshall closed his flight log. In the fading light, he could almost hear the heartbeat of an invisible machine half a world away. The steady pulse of assembly lines, pistons, riveters, women in coveralls, conveyor belts endless as war itself. And for the first time, he felt something colder than defeat, admiration, not for the pilots who fought him, but for the nation that made them possible. Night in the desert came without warning. One moment blinding sun, the next darkness thick as smoke. The camp at Gazala glowed faintly under a crescent moon. Lanterns swung from tent poles, shadows danced on canvas, and the air carried the low hum of a generator running out of fuel. Inside the officers' mess, Marshall sat with his squadron, the mood brittle. Their laughter sounded forced now, stretched thin between fatigue and denial. On the far wall, a portable film projector clattered to life. Lieutenant Kruger poured himself schnapps and muttered, "Captured Allied footage. Command sent it for morale." Marshall didn't look up. "Morale," he said flatly. "That's a word we use when we have nothing left to sell." The film flickered onto the canvas. Grainy, black and white, American newsreel. P-40 Warhawks taking off from desert strips, mechanics waving, pilots laughing, shark mouths grinning beneath spinning props. The narrator's voice, calm and proud, spoke through the static. Rugged, simple, and unstoppable. The Curtiss P-40, the workhorse of freedom. The Germans laughed, but weakly. Kruger raised his glass. "Workhorse! Ha! We fly stallions, not farm animals." A ripple of amusement, then silence. Because the next shot froze them all. A P-40 streaking across the desert sky, sunlight gleaming off its chipped fuselage, banking into a perfect roll that ended with a vertical climb straight into the sun. The same impossible maneuver Marshall had seen days before. His chest tightened. He could hear the sandstorm outside brushing against the canvas like whispers of ghosts. On screen, the American pilot saluted the camera, teeth flashing beneath his goggles. The men around Marshall shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. The laughter died. In the darkness, the film reel clicked, looped, and began again, the same image replaying, the Warhawk climbing, the shark mouth opening toward the heavens. Kruger reached to shut it off, but Marshall spoke softly. "Leave it." His voice cracked like old glass. They watched it once more, the crude, battered machine defying its limits. Marshall whispered, almost to himself, "We built beauty to win a war. They built ugliness to survive it." No one answered. Outside, thunder rolled in from the coast, not weather, but bombers. The generator sputtered, the film died, and for a moment all that remained was silence and the memory of his own laughter, now echoing back at him like a confession. The bombing began just before dawn. The sky trembled with the distant rumble of B-24 Liberators, their engines droning like a slow heartbeat over the desert. Marshall stood outside his tent, the wind tugging at his uniform, watching the faint silhouettes glide overhead, black crosses of motion against the fading stars. Anti-aircraft fire flashed from Tobruk's perimeter, red arcs rising helplessly toward the clouds. He didn't flinch. He'd seen bombing before. But this felt different. It wasn't terror he felt, it was recognition. The sound above wasn't chaos anymore. It was rhythm, precision, machinery working as one. He thought of what Förster, the engineer, had said, "They build for the world they fight in." The words now echoed with every engine note overhead. At the edge of the runway, Weber crouched near a hangar, shielding his head from falling dust. "Herr Hauptmann," he shouted, "we must take cover." Marshall didn't move. His eyes followed the formation, 20, maybe 30 planes in perfect symmetry. The rising sun struck their bellies, turning them silver. He realized what he was looking at wasn't a squadron. It was an idea, one the Reich could never match. In Germany, production meant pride. Here, it meant power. He imagined the factories he'd heard about over the radio. Women with bandanas welding wings in Detroit. Black smoke rising over Ohio. Conveyor belts clattering through Kansas City. America didn't worship the individual pilot. It worshipped the system that fed him. A bomb exploded a few kilometers away, sending a tremor through the sand. The hangar doors buckled. A few men screamed. Marshall stayed still. His thoughts were somewhere far across the Atlantic, in that endless grid of factories and furnaces that never slept. He spoke softly, almost reverently. They fight with factories. Weber looked up, confused. Sir? Marshall's voice was distant. Do you know why they can fly like that? Because they don't need to believe in one perfect pilot or one perfect machine. The sky belongs to those who build it, again and again. The bombers turned north, their silhouettes fading into morning. Silence returned, broken only by the hiss of settling dust. Weber approached slowly. You should rest, Herr Hauptmann. Marshall smiled faintly, eyes still fixed on the sky. Rest? The Americans don't rest. They just refuel. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the faint smell of oil, the smell of industry, of movement, of inevitability. And as the last bomber vanished into the sun, Marshall whispered to himself, not with envy, but with the solemn awe of a man who finally understood the scale of what he was fighting. They don't conquer, they manufacture destiny. Summer, 1943. The war had moved on, leaving behind the wrecks and ghosts of the desert. Rommel's army was retreating north. German airfields were being abandoned one after another, the sand reclaiming what the Reich could no longer hold. Hauptmann Hans Joachim Marschall no longer flew. His squadron had been folded into another unit. His Messerschmitt left stripped and silent beneath a torn hangar roof. The laughter that had once filled the desert mornings, the banter, the arrogance, the certainty was gone. He'd been reassigned to Europe, but never made it. The convoy carrying him was strafed off the coast of Crete. He spent 3 days adrift before rescue by an Italian patrol boat. By the time he reached Sicily, the war he'd believed in no longer existed. The sky, his sky, belonged to someone else now. He saw it first from the docks at Palermo. Rows of P-40s lined up on an Allied strip across the bay. Sunlight gleaming off the shark teeth painted on their noses. Once, he would have mocked them. Now he couldn't look away. Each aircraft bore its history in scars. Bullet holes patched with dull rivets, sand-worn paint, exhaust stains trailing like war paint. But they were still flying, still working, still alive. He walked closer, limping slightly from the crash in Libya. Allied guards watched but didn't raise their rifles. The war was ending. Even enemies were tired. A nearby Warhawk taxied to a halt, its propeller slowing to silence. The pilot climbed out, an American captain, maybe mid-20s, leather jacket stained with sweat and oil. He removed his helmet and caught Marshall watching him. For a moment, neither man moved. Then the American reached into his pocket, pulled out a pack of Lucky Strikes, and offered one across the distance. Marshall hesitated, then stepped forward and took it. The cigarette was warm from the man's flight suit. The American struck a match and said, in perfect German, "You flew the yellow-nosed Messerschmitts, didn't you?" Marshall nodded once. JG-27. The American smiled faintly. "You gave us hell." Marshall lit the cigarette. "We thought we would win the sky forever." The American shrugged, looking toward his Warhawk. "Maybe you did, for a while. But forever's a long time when Detroit's awake." Marshall chuckled, a dry, honest sound that surprised him. "Detroit," he said softly, tasting the word. "That's what beat us." The American extended a hand. "No, sir. Reality beat you." They shook, the handshake of two men who had both survived something larger than themselves. The wind shifted. The smell of oil, sweat, and sun-baked metal filled the air. Marshall looked at the Warhawk again. The same crude lines, the same chipped teeth. But this time, he didn't see ugliness. He saw truth. The kind of truth that could only be built, not imagined. He took one last drag from the cigarette and exhaled slowly. "It was never the plane," he said, almost to himself. "It was the world that built it." The American nodded, and the world that believed in building it. Behind them, a new squadron of P-51 Mustangs roared down the runway. Sleeker, faster, the next generation already taking flight. The sound made Marshall smile, though it stung something deep inside him. He looked up at the contrails stretching across the Sicilian sky. White threads weaving a pattern no German machine would ever dominate again. The sun dipped low, painting the horizon gold. For the first time in years, Marshall felt no anger, no loss, only awe. He turned to the American and said quietly, "In the end, perhaps we flew for the same thing." The pilot tilted his head. "What's that?" Marshall smiled faintly. "To see which idea could reach higher." The American nodded once, thoughtful. "Guess we both found out." They stood there for a long moment, two men beneath the quiet thunder of the machines that would outlive them both. When the last light faded, Marshall turned toward the sea. The horizon burned red again, just as it had that morning in Libya. But this time, the fire felt human. And for the first time, he felt peace in knowing that the laugh he once gave, the laugh that began this war in his heart, had finally gone silent. Years later, the world forgot his name. Hans Joachim Marschall lived quietly in Hamburg after the war, fixing radios, mending bicycles, repairing the small machines that still worked when the grand ones were gone. He never flew again. He didn't need to. The sky had already taught him everything. Sometimes, on clear mornings, he would step out onto his balcony and watch the contrails stretching across the heavens, white scars on blue. Airliners now, not warplanes, but to him, they still sounded like destiny. He'd seen the transformation up close, a world once obsessed with perfection, learning that progress comes from production. The Americans hadn't defeated the Luftwaffe because their pilots were braver or their planes faster. They won because they'd learned how to make machines that reflected their people, rugged, adaptable, and endlessly replaceable. He once told a friend over coffee, "We Germans engineered for eternity. The Americans built for tomorrow." That line stayed with him for the rest of his life. In his workshop, he kept a small relic on a shelf above his tools, a single piece of metal, dull and bent, cut from the wreck of a P-40 Warhawk. He'd taken it from the desert before leaving Libya. On quiet nights, he would trace his fingers over its surface, remembering the rough welds, the crude simplicity that once offended him, and later humbled him. It was the color of dust and courage. He never spoke of that American pilot again, the one who had spared him over the dunes, the one who'd saluted instead of killing. But sometimes, when the wind shifted and the world fell silent, Marshall would close his eyes and hear it again. That uneven roar, that defiant engine, climbing into a sky that belonged to no one. He would smile then, faintly, the way a man smiles at the truth he took too long to see. Because in the end, the war hadn't been about nations, or borders, or machines. It was about ideas. And the P-40, that crude, battered, unrefined Warhawk, had carried one idea higher than any other, that freedom isn't perfect, but it flies. What would you have done if you'd seen your enemy rise into the sun, not to destroy you, but to remind you what endurance looks like?